So tonight's guest is somebody called Heather Christie, also known as ArchaeoPlays over on Twitch and YouTube and other places. But the story behind Heather being with us tonight is that I was listening to one of my favourite podcasts, a Minecraft podcast, and I hear that there's this person from the UK or living in the UK talking about what they do in Minecraft. And then I find that they've got these lots of chronic illnesses, and they're basically doing similar sort of thing on Twitch to me. It just felt like a no-brainer. So for anyone that's sort of like isn't aware of what you do and the work you're doing and that, I understand you live with multiple long-term health conditions. I think it's fair to say, isn't it?
I have 7.
Okay. So
there was a point when I was being diagnosed where I kept saying that I was trying desperately to convince my body that chronic illnesses aren't Pokemon and we really don't need to catch them all, and I was failing spectacularly. So I have 7. Thankfully, I haven't been diagnosed with more than 7 at this point, but life's long, maybe.
Well, clearly you've got a great one. and unfortunately, because I know you've definitely got at least one like autoimmune in there, and somebody that's from that autoimmune background. Unfortunately, they are a bit like buses, aren't they? We very rarely get one in isolation. So how did that? I know this is a big question, bearing in mind you just said you got 7 there, but
7, yeah.
Was it just like a domino thing? Was it a gradual thing, or was it just all in one? Like,
so weirdly, well, not weirdly, probably predictably to anybody who has chronic illnesses, I wasn't diagnosed with any of them until January of 2020. So perfect time to be getting diagnosed with chronic illnesses. I was diagnosed in January of 2020, but the effects of several that I wasn't even diagnosed with until a year and a half later, I'd been feeling since I was a teenager. So for a couple of decades at this point. Basically what had started happening was I started getting really severe pain, like really bad pelvic pain. Which is bad if you have female anatomy, just FYI. I mean, it's bad in general, but especially if you have female anatomy, pelvic pain is not normal. You should talk to someone about it. Just general PSA. So I started having such severe pain that it would I thought that I needed an ambulance or needed to go to the hospital. And it turned out that nothing was actually wrong. It was just an incredible amount of pain. Well, nothing was visibly wrong, I should say. Things were wrong. They just couldn't see what. And so there was a period of about a year, a little less, probably like 9 months. So in like May of 2019, I ended up at the hospital. And they didn't see anything. So they said, speak to your GP. So I spoke to my GP. And thankfully, I basically just said, so for people who aren't in the UK, when you go talk to a GP, you do often have like your specific GP. But if it's something that's urgent, you'll go to whoever's available in the practice on the day. And thankfully, the person that I was allocated to was a guy who had spent most of his career in gynecology, but he had sort of eased back into family medicine for like the last maybe decade of his career. So he was looking at things, and we did a whole bunch of tests, and everything came back looking perfectly normal. But obviously there were problems. So I asked him, just said, is there anything, even if it's complete, like, I don't need you to tell me why you think this. You don't even need to have a reason. Is there anything that you're thinking maybe it's this, just in the back of your mind? And he said, well, I have no reason, absolutely zero reason to say that it's this, aside from the fact that we can't rule it out. I think you might have endometriosis. And I was like, okay, well, that's a name. I can figure out what this is. And then about 6 months later, 4 months later, I can count. 3 or 4 months, August, I can count. I'm a functional person.
Trust me, if I was asked to give my full diagnosis story now, it'd just blur into one. So don't worry.
Yeah. I will try to keep it short because it is a long one. But yeah, so in August, I before I became as disabled as I am, I did a lot of museum education, or outdoor museum education especially. So I did historical tours around the University of Glasgow because it's the third oldest university in the fourth oldest university in the English speaking world. there's a lot of Cambridge and Oxford like to fight, so we let them fight.
Really?
Basically.
As someone who went to university in Cambridge, I'm well aware of that.
I feel like that generally sums up, the situation. So I was giving an outdoor tour, and I finished the tour, went to go hand in the keys, and had like the worst pain I've ever had in my life. At that time, I've now had worse pain because chronic pain, and it's fun. But it was really bad. And I was walking back to my building where my office is. And the office that I was in is kind of like you have to wind around the building and then go through one door that has like a key code lock on it. And then our office also has a lock on it. So I was walking back and realizing that I didn't know if, like, I had messaged my husband who also worked at the university. I didn't know if he was going to be able to find me before I had like passed out. And if that was like, had to do the mental gymnastics of should I go to my office or should I sit here outside the building? Because if I sit outside the building and I pass out, then somebody's going to notice. Whereas if I'm in my office behind a keypad that he doesn't know the key to the code for, that's a problem. So basically it was bad enough that we went to the hospital, spent the night in the hospital, and independently at like 6 a.m. Some of the residents came in and said, yeah, we're thinking it might be endometriosis. And I was like, well, my GP independently thinks that. So it might be endometriosis. So after that, I tried desperately to hold on to a job teaching, but it wasn't possible. And you can probably imagine with 7 chronic illnesses, it's just not physically possible. So in January, December to January of that year, so 2019 to 2020, they did an MRI. And this is something a lot of people don't necessarily know about endometriosis. There's a little bit of a misconception that it can only be diagnosed via surgery. That's incorrect. It can only be ruled out with surgery. But you can be diagnosed. If it's bad enough, you can be diagnosed with an MRI. And I was. So they did the MRI and they're like, oh, yeah, no, it's everywhere. So no wonder you're in pain. And I was like, oh, thank you. Okay. Vindication, validation, helpful.
I was going to say, how did that make you feel? Like, because sometimes, like, I've been through that where you feel like a fraud, or maybe I don't know, you can even get to the dark places where you start thinking you're like too weak, and maybe that's why you're feeling so much pain. And how did that feel?
It was very nice to have it confirmed. And I think especially echoing that particularly for things like women's health, where it hasn't gotten as much attention. And there is this sense of, oh, well, you're in pain every month. Everybody's in pain every month. It's like, no, you don't understand. Like there are different levels of pain. It's very much if you're in so much pain that ibuprofen doesn't cover it, then you should talk to someone. You should really talk to someone. So thankfully that GP spotted it early. But they diagnosed me. They're like, yeah, you have stage 4 endometriosis, which doesn't mean, so the stages in endometriosis correspond to the degree of symptoms that you're experiencing, not necessarily, better phrasing, they don't correlate to the effect it's having on your day. So stages, there's like the extent of endometriosis in your system. You can have lots of endometriosis tissue, and it might be perfectly fine. It might not affect you, or you can have very little of it and it affects you incredibly greatly. I had a lot and it was affecting me greatly. So that was fun. For those who don't necessarily know what endometriosis is, I'm realizing I should probably describe what it is before getting into other diagnoses. Endometriosis is a condition where tissue that is similar to the tissue that grows in the lining of the uterus grows outside of the uterus. It grows anywhere else in the body that it darn well pleases. And the problem there is that it tends to behave like tissue that is inside the uterus. So you can imagine every month it tries to do a certain thing that is very painful. Additionally, it likes to stick to things. So apologies for the graphic description, but it effectively glues your organs together in very painful ways, because your organs aren't supposed to be glued together, and they try to move in a way that doesn't account for being glued together, and so there's a lot of pain. It's a very painful condition. So I had
Can I just say, first of all, you're doing my job for me. Like, can you come on every week? Like, the fact that my next question was, could you maybe tell us a little bit about what I do?
I was about to move on. I was like,
you're brilliant. I'm going to sit back. I'm going to get comfortable, and then you just go.
So I was diagnosed with that in January of 2020, and I was referred for urgent surgery in January of 2020. And obviously 2020 didn't mean that this urgent surgery happened urgently, because 2020 was 2020. So I didn't get surgery for 16 months. So I was sitting for 16 months with my organs glued together. And it was...
Are you in the UK at this point?
Yes.
Yeah. I was going to say welcome to the UK, but I thought I might just...
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Especially with that level of pain, because I've been there where that you know you're going to pass out or be sick, or like my wife knows if I'm vomiting, then my pain is like the highest. So that level of pain, until you've experienced it, is just something else, isn't it? So
the amount of pain where you can't form words anymore and you don't understand words anymore, that's something else. It's something else.
Yeah.
So they referred me for urgent surgery. Obviously, COVID happened, and so urgent surgery didn't happen. And also in the UK, when you're referred for urgent surgery, depending on the condition, it can take a while to get urgent surgery anyway. So basically, May of 2021, they were finally able to actually operate, and I think I may have even, they may have jumped me in the queue a little bit, because by the spring of 2021, it was affecting all of my other systems. So I was not a functional human, and I had been on really heavy painkillers for a year and a half, and it was bad.
I just had no idea it was that far reaching. Like my own sister has it, and I see the horrific pain, and and I hear about the fallout and the issues it causes, but I had no idea it could be that far wide reaching.
Yeah. So for fun information for everybody, you can have endometriosis in your nose. Or your throat. It can be in your spine. It can be anywhere. It'll go anywhere. And removing the requisite organs, or the responsible organs, doesn't do anything. So it's just gonna happen regardless. So the goal with endometriosis generally is to mitigate it through non-surgical means if you can, and then use surgery if needed, and try to maximize the amount of time between surgeries. But generally speaking, if you have endometriosis, you're probably going to need multiple surgeries every 3 to 5 years for the rest of, for most of the rest of your life, basically. So, which is why they try to prolong the time between it, because every surgery is a risk. So obviously, having one every 3 years is a big difference to having one every 5 years. So, yeah.
That's just, I'm seeing it in a totally different light. And so obviously surgery, you've talked there, is a big option. And so it's sort of almost a regular thing. Is there any sort of treatment, like prevention, that helps with it?
So yes and no, depending on the person. One of the difficulties with endometriosis is that it's so poorly understood, even though it's probably one of the better understood chronic illnesses in gynecology. It's still not very well understood. And part of that is because different people react differently to different types of treatments. So for some people, dietary changes are all they need, and that's generally fine for them. And then there is a point to which the tissue continues growing, so you will eventually need surgery. But to really mitigate the day-to-day symptoms, dietary change might be all that some people need, or it could be some regular pain assistance or helping with sleep or something. A lot of people will go on to hormonal medication, so various types of birth control. That does not work for me. My body does not like female hormones, it turns out. So, which we'll get to. Don't worry.
Oh, yeah.
There's a reason. But yeah, it very much didn't help me at all. It just made things worse. We've tried like 3 or 4 different types of hormonal birth control stuff, and no, no, it's like the worst.
That trial and error thing, though, is horrendous with chronic illnesses. We don't talk. We should maybe do an episode just on that.
Trial and error,
and to well managed, if at all, because that journey's horrible.
So yeah, it's rough. It's a rough journey. So I had basically they operated in May of 2021. And when the surgeon met with me after surgery, she was like, okay, so you definitely have endometriosis. I mean, you didn't need me to tell you that. We've taken care of that we can see so far. But you definitely also have PCOS, or polycystic ovary syndrome, which is chronic illness number 2. Which is basically a condition where there are various reasons that this happens, but basically your ovaries end up with lots of cysts on them. And those are very painful, as you might imagine. Having cysts on any organ is painful. And because ovaries move a bit, the cysts end up getting agitated a lot. So PCOS, and part of it is that, but this is what I was talking about with hormones. I also hormonally have PCOS. So there are like 3 different ways that you can be diagnosed with PCOS. Well, 3 different criteria, and you have to meet 2 of them basically. So you have to have polycystic ovaries, or you have to have abnormal hormone levels for women. And there are a couple different hormones, and I won't get into the details because we'll be here all night. But there's a hormonal thing, or you have irregular cycles, basically.
Okay.
So I had the polycystic ovaries and the hormonal stuff, and you can have all 3 of them, but you only need 2 to be diagnosed. Okay. So basically, in surgery, they were like, well, we were in that area, we could see you had polycystic ovaries. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure that out. So yeah. And then they also said, we're looking at those organs, you also almost certainly have or will imminently have adenomyosis. Adenomyosis is basically the same thing as endometriosis. And if you thought the graphic descriptions were done, I'm sorry.
No, you go for it. We're not here to sugarcoat stuff. We're here to get people to sit up and listen.
Adenomyosis is the same as endometriosis, and the only way that they differ is in where they happen. So endometriosis, the tissue grows anywhere outside of the uterus in the body. For adenomyosis, it grows through the uterus. Like it goes through the wall of the uterus. It will just eat right through it, which is great. Adding additional pain and misery.
I was gonna say, I'm sure that's not a walk in the park.
Yeah. So effectively at the time of surgery, they were saying, well, it's not clear that it's, actually actively going through yet. Obviously, we're not going to biopsy your uterus or anything to check. But you probably within the next few months, you will probably have symptoms that are very clearly adenomyosis. And that did happen. So that's another one. And both of those, again, PCOS and PCOS is often a dietary mitigation kind of thing, although that's one of my medical horror stories. The surgeon was not a PCOS specialist, and she told me to go on the strictest keto diet possible to treat PCOS, and she told me to do it immediately after surgery. And for those who don't know, a keto diet basically is mimicking starvation in the body, without actively necessarily starving you, but it's basically starvation. And so telling anybody to do that without proper dietary assistance is a problem, but especially telling someone to do that immediately after surgery with the threat of heart attack and diabetes, really bad. And
you need your strength to recover. And that's mad.
I continued asking them for assistance in it, other than just the app that they recommended, for a full year. Don't give people the benefit of a full year. Don't do that to yourself. They just kept not giving me assistance. and then eventually said, well, we're not PCOS specialists, so you really need to talk to a PCOS specialist. I was like, why didn't you say that to my GP or to me, to anybody? So that was that. At this point, that is one of the downsides. And I think I don't talk about this like ever really, but I now have a very poor relationship with food. As you might imagine. So,
it's just understandable.
So it's getting better, but it is something with chronic illness that's a lot of the time the treatments that we try or the things that we're told to do end up creating issues themselves. And some of those are like actual physical issues, and some of those are mental issues. And it's awful. So if somebody tells you to try keto and doesn't put you in touch with a dietitian, have them write to your GP about it. And if they don't write to your GP, don't do it. That would be my advice. It's not worth it.
This is where the regulars hear me go off on my Instagram rant about people calling themselves advocates and then prescribe and that sort of stuff. And that's just it just shows how dangerous it is. And I think in the world we live in at the moment, it's scary how quickly someone can just chuck a title and start throwing that sort of information out.
And in fairness to the surgeon, they are an endometriosis specialist. They're very good with endometriosis. They're not very good at all with PCOS. And you wouldn't necessarily know that. I mean, I didn't think that she was the one telling me that I had PCOS. So it is something to keep in mind that people's specialties doesn't necessarily cover things even that seem related. Make sure you talk about it with a GP and get something in writing as well from the person who's prescribing it. But so that was where chronic illnesses numbers 2 and 3 were diagnosed.
You're doing very well to keep up with the numbering on this, so thank you. Really appreciate it.
I was like, oh, actually, there are 3 more that I need to talk about. So, technically 4, but one of them barely appears. Well, there are 4. So then, after this year of dietary struggles, I finally spoke with someone who was like, let's just refer you to a dietitian. I was like, I've been asking for that for a year. And they finally were able to put it through, basically. I don't know what the issue was before, but anyway, a dietitian met with me and was like, oh, let's talk. And we talked about PCOS. For the record, in the UK, dietitians recommend following a Mediterranean diet for PCOS, which is very different to a keto diet, you might notice. Mediterranean diet is basically like traditional Italian, Greek kind of Mediterranean diets. Very healthy, generally what a lot of dietitians recommend in general across the board. So I was talking to this dietitian and he said, is there anything that you're noticing, like foods that you have issues with or anything? And I said, well, stuff like it's stuff with like onions or mushrooms or like sometimes garlic. And he was like, oh, that's sounding a lot like IBS. And I was like, oh, I mean, like, okay. And he said, how about you try doing a low FODMAP diet and see what happens. And within like 2 days, there was a massive difference.
Oh, really?
Like, oh,
wow.
Yes. And that was something where I'd been having those kind of digestive issues since I was a teenager, since I was like 13 years old. And he was the first one to be like, oh, maybe actually you have a serious digestive system issue. Like, oh, thanks. Wonderful. So he was like, yeah, try this and see what happens. And it helped enormously. And that was probably the thing that allowed me to actually be a streamer and be a YouTuber because before that, I was far too ill to do much of anything. But yeah, so that was kind of like summer of 2022. And around the same time, was it around then? I guess actually I skipped over another chronic illness. I forgot about it. I forget when it happened.
You're sharing so much. I really appreciate it. So don't apologize.
Yeah. I skip over stuff. So basically, interstitial cystitis got diagnosed between the PCOS adenomyosis nonsense and the IBS nonsense. Interstitial cystitis happened. So basically I was continually having additional pelvic pain, basically. And it seemed connected to my bladder in a way. So basically, GP and I did some tests. It seemed like basically pointing in the direction of interstitial cystitis, which is also called, like, I think, bladder pain syndrome, BPS or something. Basically, your bladder hurts for reasons unknown. Sometimes that's effectively what it is, and it can be extra painful when your bladder is doing its job of what it's supposed to do in a daily function. It can also just hurt a lot when it's not doing much of anything. It just hurts, and sometimes it can be brought on by things you're eating as well. So, for example, if you have tomatoes, that can exacerbate it. If you have like a tomato sauce kind of thing. But also it depends because different people react differently and it's not well known. And it's one of those things where technically it's not officially diagnosed because the only way to officially diagnose it is through like a surgical biopsy. And my GP was like, yeah, no, we're not. No, that's not worth it. We're just gonna say you have enough going on in that region that you probably have this. And I was like, okay. So yeah. So then the IBS diagnosis happened, and the dietitian actually said, interstitial cystitis and IBS are often comorbid. So I'm not surprised to hear that you have that as well. I was like, oh, okay. So, and then IBS is also comorbid with things like PCOS and endometriosis. They're all connected because they're all in the same area. Because that's where all the organs are for fun reasons. Whoever designed humans the way they are, I would like a word about efficiency and safeguarding. And biology is my enemy at times. Yeah. And then in like October of 2022, I had severe like upper abdominal, well, kind of like rib cage area pain.
Right, yeah.
And that was unusual. And basically I ended up at the out of hours GP again and everything. And they scheduled me they were thinking that I might have gallstones. And okay. I said this to my GP and she was like, okay, if you have 6 chronic illnesses and you have gallstones, I don't know what to tell you. I don't know. I mean, like, unlucky, that's fair. Yeah. So yeah, and then I went for like an ultrasound, and they're like, yeah, you have gallstones. I'm like, well, GP, you're never gonna guess, but yeah. But then they referred me to a gastro specialist to talk about like next steps. Because basically with gallstones, there's the main way to resolve it is through surgery, but only if it's really affecting your day. And I met with the specialist, and he said, well, actually, a lot of the symptoms you're describing that are in that area are actually more consistent with IBS symptoms that are maybe a little bit exacerbated by the gall. So you definitely still have this issue, and it may flare from time to time, but it is not nearly so bad that we need to like remove your gallbladder. So I was like, oh, okay, well, that's great. So those are the 7 chronic illnesses.
That's just my first question. How do you, like, if I'm sitting at home watching this, I'm thinking like, how do you know what's flaring? What's like, can you tell the difference in pain? Like, 'cause it's everything's so close together there, isn't it? Like,
that's an excellent question. I can sometimes, and sometimes I can't. Part of it is that like when the endometriosis and the PCOS are flaring, they're usually flaring together. Same with adenomyosis. Like all 3 of those, they'll flare at the same time, unless there's like a cyst that has gone off the rails or something. They're generally all at once, which means that it's extra painful. But it also means that helpfully, I know that it's the 3 of them doing their thing all at once. When with the digestive stuff, though, that just doesn't function on a daily basis. So there's an element of like there, and it's not particularly awfulness. It's it's mostly what it is like I'll sit down, I'll have like my husband and I will have cooked something and we'll be sitting down to eat it, and I'll have like 2 bites of whatever we're eating. And then my brain is just like, yeah, we're done. We're not eating more of this. Nope, sorry, can't do it. Uh, and I'm like, oh, okay, wonderful. I've got like a full plate of food here and I can't do anything with it. Or it'll be like days at a time where my brain will just be like, yeah, no, we're not eating anything but granola bars or toast for 3
It must
days.
be hard when you associate with that pain. Do you know what I mean? Like, as
Yeah.
somebody that, so my pain really spikes, I can vomit, and then I won't want to do certain things because I will feel sick. And I know, walking the dog doesn't make me feel sick, but it's like that safety mode, isn't it, that your brain goes into?
Yeah. It's yes, there you find the foods that are like foolproof for you, I think is I don't know if that's a proper term for it, but basically like the foods that you like, there are certain things that I know my stomach and my brain will always accept without question. One of those is tea, one of those is granola bars, one of those is toast. So or like white rice usually. But yeah, anything else, I always have those stocked in the house somewhere, and then hope that I can have a vegetable or something, and that I can have. Like today, I had an apple. That was great. I had an apple for the first time in like 3 weeks or more. It's been a long time since I've had fruit. So it's it's a little bit rough because you can imagine if you're having flares every week or every other week where you're not able to eat much more than granola bars, your body doesn't do so hot.
Yes.
But helpfully the dietitian that I was talking to, he was, I was feeling kind of like, oh, my nutrition is tanked, and he said, well, yeah, that's true. However, the choices that you're making, like when you're in a flare, and you're needing to make food decisions, you're not making the decision between a healthy meal and a granola bar. You're making the decision between a granola bar or nothing. And that helped reframe everything to a point where it just took all of the feeling of guilt away from those kind of flares. And I eat a lot of granola bars. Not gonna lie, there are a lot of granola bars. But I don't.
That word guilt though comes up on the show so many times. Where someone will flare, they'll blame themselves, or unfortunately, a medical professional at some point has made them feel like they did something to cause it, and then it sticks with people. So that word is very common.
And I think it's also common, like for people with chronic illnesses, certainly for people who become disabled over the course of their life. And I think that applies to chronic illness, but I also think it's wider ranging than that. There is a degree to which we lose physical fitness in one way or another. And society is like, you must be physically active and physically fit or you're not a good enough person. So it can be really difficult not to internalize, the changes that you're seeing with your ability to do things and make that, it's really difficult to not let that translate into you're a terrible person and you're failing. And as an overachiever, it's a problem. And so I feel like that dietitian, like there are certain medical professionals that I can point to that changed things drastically for me in a positive way, and he's one of them. Just from saying that one thing of like, you're not choosing between a healthy meal and rice, you're choosing between rice and nothing. So if your options are rice, a granola bar, some toast, or nothing, pick the one that has the most nutrients that you haven't had recently. Another thing that recently has been a thing is, having fresh fruit and veg can be really difficult when you have digestive issues because your stomach doesn't want them and then they go bad. And then you've got an entire thing of apples that nobody has eaten and they've gone bad and everything. Food waste is massive. And so we try to reduce it as much as we can. And one way to do that, for example, is to have something like apple juice instead of fresh apples. And obviously, apple juice is not the most nutritious of things. But again, when the choice is between apple juice and nothing or apple juice and no fruit at all, then the apple juice is actually still providing something, so
it's that
nice to
reframing,
have
isn't
it
it?
reframed. Yeah.
We talk about it a lot when we have people on here with long-term pain and chronic pain, that, okay, I can't do what I used to do there, but doing this as something, or if I do this little bit of movement and I suffer a bit tomorrow, that's a good pain. It's a different type of pain to what, and it is that reframe, but it's so hard to, it's like unwiring your brain, isn't it?
Yeah. It's the socialization is is difficult to undo. And it happens in literally every element of your life is the other thing. And I know I'm preaching to the choir for a lot of people, but for anybody who doesn't have chronic illness, or for anybody who is going through chronic illness and, maybe your early days, it can feel like everything you do feels like a failure, because how can you call it a success when all you did was make it to the bathroom and take a shower? I'm here to tell you that taking a shower takes a lot of effort. If I have a day where I have showered, that is a win. That is amazing. So don't get upset at yourself for, not making it to, not having a nutritious meal or whatever. Like, you're doing fine. You're doing fine for your circumstances.
It's all perspective. And like I find I have to remind myself as well, I'm not getting any younger. And the trouble is, a lot of my grief links back to like my early 20s, when a lot of my disability started, and try to remind myself, Joel, you're nearly 40. You wouldn't be able to do what you did then anyway, regardless of your condition. Just accept you're getting old. But I think, unfortunately, your brain is just instantly, it's like you're looking to blame something, aren't you? And unfortunately, it can be sort of wasted energy. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for sharing all of that. That was so much there. And like I say, you made my job really easy, because I just sit and listen. So I took all of that in, which is rare, because I'm often having to think, right, what's the next question? Where are we going to go? So for you to just go through all of that so effortlessly, and you speak so well, I really appreciate it. I'm conscious that we've got a lot of people watching us live here on the Chronic Pain Club that want to hear us talk more about games and, and archaeology and stuff like that.
Yeah, let's talk about fun stuff.
But what I would say before we move on, so I feel I'm being like really cold that you've shared all of that, and we're now just moving. But there is a link here, guys. But thank you to everyone that's got involved in the live chat. It's been amazing to watch that. And for those of you that are listening to this back on the podcast, please do try and catch us live one evening on YouTube, because it's a really supportive community. But so obviously let's start with archaeology. Where did that come from? I'd love to know how you got into that.
Yeah. So when I was a teenager, my aunt worked at a summer camp where teenagers from across the world went to summer camp to learn like peace building, dialogue, cultural connectivity kind of skills. And so I went when I was like 13, because that was the youngest you could be and still be able to go. And I was obsessed with other cultures and other places and other languages. And so I did. And it was phenomenal. And I remember my mom picked me up. This was like a 3-week long summer camp. So on the longer side for summer camps. And my mom picked me up, and she was like, how's it going? I was like, it's good. I wish that I could just like learn about other people's cultures for a living, like that I could just do that for a job. And she looked at me and she goes, honey, you can. It's a field called anthropology. I was like, you're joking. And she's like, no, you can. So basically from when I was about 13 years old, I was like, I'm going to be an anthropologist. And that was like one track mind. And then I got to college, where I could obviously actually study anthropology, and learned that archaeology was part of it. So in the United States, anthropology has 4 subfields, which are biological anthropology, linguistic anthropology, cultural anthropology, and archaeological anthropology. Biological anthropology has a lot to do with human biology, and that can include human evolution, but it also includes humans' relationships to diseases and healthcare and things like that. Linguistic anthropology is human languages and how humans relate to each other through language. Cultural anthropology is modern human cultures and how they're interacting today. And then archaeological anthropology is literally anything that humans have done, but in the past. So I got really interested in archaeology, which I kind of already, like, I was always kind of into history and things. My dad worked at an outdoor museum, so I had been working like I started working at outdoor museums when I was like 13. So it was I
You
was
had
primed.
access. Yeah.
Yeah, I was primed. But yeah, the in college, I really loved learning anthropology, but one of the things that struck me in my first year of anthropology classes was that a lot of the classes I had for linguistic, like I love languages, and I was like, oh, I could be a linguist. That would be really cool. And then I took linguistic classes, like classes in linguistics, and felt like a lot of like a lot of the people were being taken out of the study of linguistics, and that is not accurate for the field of linguistics right now today. But that was the impression that I was getting as a first year student in the classes I was taking. And the same was true of the cultural anthropology classes. I felt like a lot of it, it got boiled down into kinship charts. And I was like, I'm not here for, like, I mean, kinship is interesting as a concept. I am not here to learn how to properly create a kinship chart unless that's important to the people I'm talking to. So I wasn't like disappointed, but I was a little hesitant. Whereas archaeology, the thing that I love about archaeology is that we don't have the people anymore. So we're desperately trying to put them back into the story. And if we had the people there, then we would love to talk to them. And again, this is, these were impressions of a first year student several decades ago. So it's not the state of the field today. It's probably not even the state of the field then either. But yeah, so I gravitated towards archaeology. And for a while, I didn't know exactly what I wanted to study. And then okay, all right. This is where you're going to learn that I'm a massive nerd. If you didn't guess that already from the PhD in archaeology,
We're both streaming Minecraft. Like we can't.
That too, that too. That's true. Yeah. So I when I was in like my first year of undergrad, I said I was into languages. As a teenager, I still like languages. They're cool. I was curious about linguistics in general, and if you read any books that had been written about learning languages in the like 2000s ish, you would have heard the trope that Indonesian is the easiest language for a native English speaker to learn, and it was repeated in like all of these books. And I kept reading that sentence and be like, "Are you sure?" because that seems ridiculous that like Indonesian would be easy to learn. So I set out to learn Indonesian, even though it's not really possible in Rhode Island, of all places. But a friend of mine, weirdly, coincidentally, a friend of mine had actually lived in Indonesia in the 80s, and he still had like his dictionaries and language books. So he gave those to me, and I taught myself Indonesian. And then I studied abroad in Indonesia in my second year of university. and while I was there, I took archaeology classes in Indonesian in Indonesia. And I became really interested in the archaeology of Indonesia. And to answer the question, no, it's not the easiest language to learn.
I was going to say, that's a long way to go to find out if it's the easiest.
Well, I mean, there was as soon as I started learning, there were other interests that kept me going. But yeah.
I will prove this right or wrong.
Yeah, Indonesian is one of those languages where like it's easy to pick up how to sound like a 2-year-old who doesn't quite know the language, like not even a regular 2-year-old, but also like just a 2-year-old that is still figuring out what words do. So you can form sentences. You're not going to sound good at all. And the other thing is that Indonesians are very nice, because if they meet people who are trying to speak Indonesian, generally speaking, they're surprised and like, oh, that's great. Like it, in this sort of, oh, it's fantastic that you're learning my language and you sound phenomenal, even if you're not putting words together in a coherent manner. If you want to sound like an academic in Indonesian, not an easy thing to do. Not an easy thing to do. At least if your native language is English. If your native language is like Malaysian, then you're doing a lot. That's going to be a lot simpler. But yeah.
I think the closer the distance, the more the words overlap.
Yeah,
Dialect,
exactly.
you should be able to
and there are
walk if you walked
historical
really
reasons
slowly.
why if you speak Malay, Indonesian will be easier. Because the Dutch actually took Malay and turned it into Indonesian. So
Yeah.
but yeah, so I became interested in Southeast Asian archaeology. And again, like if you thought I was a nerd before, just you wait. In Southeast Asia, a lot of what survives are like stone structures are one thing, stone and brick. And then in terms of like material culture, like the actual objects that people are using on a day-to-day basis, we don't get a whole lot because a lot of it is organic stuff and it's broken down in the jungle, right? So glass was a thing that survived, and glass beads in particular were things that survived, and they survived in their thousands in Southeast Asia. There are so many sites with so many beads, and they were making these glass beads and trading them. And it turns out they were trading them as far as like Rome. Yeah, they a seafaring ship in the late sort of 8th to 9th century in Indonesia could make it from Indonesia all the way to Madagascar without stopping, so long as they used the monsoon winds. And we know this in part because they drew it, they carved it on various temple walls, but also because some archaeologists recreated the boat and they did the trip, and they're like, yeah, no, this is possible.
Yeah, we definitely don't give people enough credit for what happened before us.
Yeah,
It's just like a theme, isn't it?
Yeah. So I became very interested in glass beads and sort of long distance trade between Southeast Asia and the surrounding kind of regions. And then there was a point at which I sort of felt very out of place doing archaeology in Indonesia, which is nothing against Indonesia or Indonesians. They're phenomenal. Really, I was looking around and seeing that Indonesia has a lot of really fantastic archaeologists who are from Indonesia and talking about Indonesian ancient culture. And I was like, well, I'm a white girl from America. I don't know, I don't know how appropriate it is necessarily. Like, what can I come in and teach them about their own ancestors? That feels a little colonial.
Yeah.
So I sort of took a while and tried to figure out what the best way to support them would be, and came to the realization that it would be to uplift their voices as much as possible, but to also get out of their way, and go do something else. So that's I was kind of like figuring out what to do, and I had right. My life sounds very weird and slapdash. And that's
no, it's amazing. Every week we share these chronic illness experiences and it get really heavy. I'm no straight away thinking this format needs to change. We need to get people on, share their experience, and then tell us a completely different story about their life, so we can get the whole person. I love it.
Yeah. So when I was still doing my undergraduate degree, and I was going to apply for a PhD program, actually. So in North America, when you do an anthropology degree, you get your bachelor's and then you apply for a joint master's and PhD, and you get them both in the same program, which is one reason why it takes longer to do a PhD in the United States. So I was applying, and I had reached out to someone I wanted to work with and did the sort of like, this is who I am, but also I'm going to add a question so that you don't think I'm weird. And so, so my question was like, is there anything, given all of that, is there anything you can think of that would make my application stronger when I do submit it in the fall? And she came back and said, oh yeah, if you have like a second or third excavation season under your belt, that'd be great. I was like, I have not done any excavation because it's not a requirement we don't have an excavation program at my university. And I was not told I needed to do that for grad school. And this was like May to June of that year. I was sending summer between then and my final year. I had like 3 months before I was going to be submitting this application. I was like, oh no. And it was also like after a lot of the field schools had already. So field schools in archaeology is basically how archaeologists learn how to dig. We go to a field school, and that's where you learn the practical practical stuff with trowels and mattocks and such. So I was kind of scrambling. The ones that I could find that were in the US were like $5,000. They were a lot of money. And I was like, I don't have $5,000 I can just drop on this. Like I had some that I had been saving kind of that maybe, but yeah. And then I found a program in Scotland, that was going to cost a total of $3,000 for the entire program, plus the room and board, plus the plane tickets. And I was like, well, and I get to go to Scotland. I mean, obviously. And my
what about
my
now you've
family's
experienced the weather? Would that still seem
yes.
as
Well, I have stayed. So
yeah.
but yeah, and in addition to that, my family's ancestry is from Scotland. So
Oh,
there was
okay,
a family
brilliant.
connection as well. But yeah, so I did the field school in Scotland, and we had found some glass. There were some glass beads that we found, but we found them in the spoil heap, which is like the dirt that you've already taken out of the ground and you've put in a pile. So
Yeah.
we didn't know where they came from. And it was very sad, but also very exciting. And so when I was trying to figure out what to do, I remembered that one of the staff members from this Scottish dig had connected with me about the glass and was like, oh, let's talk about the glass beads. And so I reached out to him again and was like, would you potentially be interested in doing like a PhD with me? But instead of, focusing on the first millennium AD in Southeast Asia, if we could do that in Scotland for glass, that'd be cool. And he thankfully was like, yeah, I do remember you. We could definitely do that. And I was like, okay. So then I came across, he said, maybe do a master's first because you're going to have to take some time to adjust to figuring out how, Scottish archaeology works. And I was like, that's fair. So I did a master's degree. I was going to continue for the PhD, but then I didn't have like a solid funding situation. And in the end, I didn't have one anyway, but I felt like I couldn't really justify it of like, I'm going to go into massive amounts of educational debt to look at glass beads. As much as I would love to be able to do that, I was like, I don't know. But then like a year later or so, I was thinking about doing photography and thinking about photography and 3D modeling in archaeology and doing that with objects that don't lend themselves well to photographing or imaging. And glass is one of those. It refracts light, it reflects light, it does all sorts of nonsense. So my PhD was in 3D modeling of archaeological small finds, which are the sort of portable things that people have, focusing mostly on materials that don't really work with the algorithms as they were at the time. And and there you go. That's my more or less my academic career in a nutshell.
That's amazing. I'm absolutely loving this genuinely because we tend to just see that chronic illness journey. We don't see the whole person always, or let's say some of the topics can be like really heavy and you'll try and maybe see if they're coping well, and that'll be your high to sort of like end on.
Mm-hmm.
So to have all of them, the medical stuff, and now we're hearing about Heather the person, and all the stuff that your hopes and dreams and stuff whilst you got these conditions as well. I think it just paints such a fuller picture. I'm loving it. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
It also helps I could listen to you talk all day. You speak so well.
It was rough as well though, because as you can imagine, I mean, not that chronic illness is ever not rough, but as you can imagine, as somebody who's worked in outdoor museums since I was like 12 or 13 years old and who has a PhD in archaeology, I got my PhD in April of 2019 was when it was technically awarded. And the graduation was in June of 2019. And so that was a mere 6 months before I was diagnosed with endometriosis and severely disabled. So basically, I spent like 15 years working towards this degree, and the point of the degree was to be able to teach archaeology at a university and do research and everything. And obviously that's not happening, and it can't happen because I can't commit to a regular schedule with chronic illness, as I'm sure regulars of this show are aware.
But as you found out when we first scheduled this discussion.
Yeah, as anyone who was looking forward to this a few weeks ago, yeah.